So we are in this series of studies where we're just picking some topics that maybe you might be uncomfortable asking other people about for yourself, and so you always kind of couch it with, hey, I'm just asking for a friend. And so today I want to raise a subject, a topic that more and more of us are actually facing. Maybe you're in the middle of it right now. If you're not in the middle of it right now, you probably will be at some point. And it's something that all of us face at one time or another. And so let's jump in. And as I jump in, I realize if you were to ask this question, it's not for you. It strictly is for a friend. But here's the question I want to address today is when is it okay to actually let go? When is it okay to let go? And I know that this question could go a lot of different directions. Specifically, I want to talk about it in the context of end of life, those last few days or weeks or maybe months of life. It's the end of life. When is it okay to let go? When is it okay to admit that a life has come to its end? And maybe it's the life of your mom, your dad, your grandmother, your grandfather, a child. Maybe it's your own life as well. When is it okay to just say, you know what, I think we're done here? When is it okay to let go? Now, that's a question that Ruth and I have been wrestling with probably for the last 10 years or so. So let me just describe a little bit of our situation, maybe to see if it's something that resonates with you. And I'll actually go back 35 years to 1983. At the age of 49, Ruth's mom, my mother-in-law Shirley, was diagnosed with stage 3 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She was diagnosed with cancer. She was only given a short period of time to actually live, but the treatments went well, and she was in remission up until 2001. 2005, while in just a routine surgery, Shirley became deathly ill when her colon was nicked, and so because of infection, we thought we were going to lose her. They took out 4 feet of her colon, and she's still alive today. December 2009, Ruth's dad, Ray, was actually diagnosed with stomach cancer in April of 2010, so just 5 short months later, he actually died. And then on Mother's Day 2012, my mom in Dallas, Texas, was diagnosed with acute leukemia. She died just 6 weeks later. And at the same time, because of complications of pneumonia, my dad was so sick he wasn't even able to attend my mother's funeral. And while in the hospital, he slipped and fell, which caused all kinds of other complications, which ended up with him spending time in a rehabilitation hospital for about 3 months. Also in 2012, we came to the conclusion, the realization that Shirley, my mother-in-law, could no longer live on her own. For years, she'd been showing signs of dementia, and it finally got to the point and processed to the point where we said, we need to move Shirley to an assisted living residence. And so in June 2012, Ruth and I flew to Houston. We cleaned out her parents' home of over 50 years. We sold the house, gave almost all of the contents away to a local charity, and August 2017, made the decision it was time for Shirley to move from Houston to Pennsylvania to be closer to us. And so a big move for a Texan to move to Pennsylvania. And January 2018, so just this last January, the decision was also made. It was time for my dad to move from Dallas to be in Houston, closer to my sister. And so the very first week he's in Houston, he floods his apartment completely. The second week he's there, he totals his car. Third week that he's there, he actually has heart issues and ends up in the hospital with heart surgery. And so now about 5 months later, we go, okay, things have settled down a little bit. Physically, he's doing better. Emotionally, he's lonely. And he tells me almost every time I talk to him, I'm just ready to die. He says, I either want to die or I want to move in and live with my sister and her family. Somehow he thinks that's next to heaven, and it'll be wonderful for him there to be with her. And I tell you all that not to make you feel sorry for me or feel bad for us and what we're experiencing, because my guess is, I tell you all that, because my guess is you're experiencing something similar in your family. And if you're not experiencing it now, you will someday. Someday you'll have a story to tell just like mine. And you'll be able to describe what's going on. Maybe it will even be someday soon that you have that kind of story. Because the truth is, someday you will die. Someday I will die. All of us will die at some point. Each and every one of us, it's coming. And so the question is, how do we prepare for those last few days? How do we prepare for the last few days? And as we talk about it, I need to make some disclaimers today. First of all, I'm not an expert on the topic of final days of life. I'm very much in the journey in this one, and I don't know all the answers, and I don't have all the information. And to be honest with you, the more I look into it, I don't think there is just one answer about how to spend your final days. When is it okay to let go? I think there may be several answers. So here's what I ask. I'm going to tell you kind of where I am on this at this point. And if you don't agree with me, don't get mad at me. Instead, Instead, let's just talk and let's learn together as we go through this. I'll also tell you that a lot of my thoughts have been affirmed and also sharpened by a book I read back in February. It was recommended to me by Rich Stearns. Rich is the president of World Vision. I read it. I love the book. And the book was written by a man named Atul Gawande, and it's entitled Being Mortal. And I love the book. It made so much sense, and I can't highly recommend it to you enough. And so, whenever I'm thinking through topics of any type or one like this, when is it time to let go? My first place is to go and say, okay, what does God have to say about it? And then I want to know, okay, what does history, what does science have to teach us about this particular topic? And so let me actually start by talking about this topic from the standpoint of history. Historically, what's gone on? Because what we're talking about is aging. What we're talking about are the final days of a person's life. And interestingly, throughout history, aging hasn't been an issue. And the reason it's not been an issue is because very few people live long enough to have to struggle with the issue of aging. And if you happen to live long enough, then it became this family thing, aging parents, and it was a multi-generational responsibility for the family to take care of a mom, a dad, a grandparent, and they would care for you. If you had no family to take care of you, then you would end up in a place that oftentimes was referred to as a poorhouse. And here's how it typically would happen. Lifespan was short, 30 years or less. For most all of human history, life was very short. And if you happen to live to 30, then you were out there on the edge as far as the length of a lifespan. And when people died, it was very abrupt. It was very sudden. And so let me illustrate it this way. If this line represents time, this line represents kind of function or an ability to live life and live it well. This is how long a person's lived. Throughout most of human history, this is what life looked like. You lived your life, and as soon as you had a problem, then it ended. And it ended very abruptly. It was very short, the way people would live. And that was, again, throughout most of human history, even up till not that far back. If you go back to the 1970 Census Bureau, they found that only 2% of the population in the United States was over the age of 65, just 2%. Today, it's closer to 14% of the population over the age of 65. Things have changed. Science, medical care improved, and lifespans began to expand. And so what happened over time is as people would live, they would hit some type of illness, which before would have taken their life, but now medicine was able to step in, keep it going, until finally at some point, life just dropped off again and ended. It was a very still, abrupt ending. And it didn't really matter your social status. It didn't matter how much money you had. Consider how our presidents before the modern era actually died. If you look at George Washington developed a throat infection in his home on December the 13th, 1799. He died the next evening, one day. He died. John Quincy Adams, Millard Fillmore, Andrew Johnson all succumbed to strokes, and they died within 2 days of their strokes. Rutherford Hayes had a heart attack. He died 3 days later. Ulysses S. Grant contracted oral cancer, took him about a year to die. But what was true with all of them is it was a very abrupt ending. The medicine continued to progress, and new developments made it possible so that there's a third pattern for the way that we die. But again, this is all real new. This is since World War II, right around the time of World War II. The picture has shifted radically. Antibiotics became available to treat infections, and breakthroughs in everything from heart surgeries to respirators to transplants became commonplace. And all of a sudden, doctors became heroes, and hospitals were popping up everywhere. In the 50s and 60s, thousands of hospitals were built. And up until that point, if you were sick, if you had something wrong with your body, then you were pretty much on your own. And most often it didn't end well, and it just ended abruptly. But all of a sudden, with this development of medicine and science and doctors and hospitals, all of a sudden, the mind shift changed, and it changed the way that we actually die. Because hospitals were springing up, and they were causing us to say, hey, cure me. You could take care of me, make my life go on longer. And so you would check into the hospital, and you would give everything over to the hospital, every part of your life, and doctors and nurses would tell you, this is what you need to wear, this is what you need to eat, this is where we're going to stick you, and this is what we're going to stick in you, and when we're going to do it. And you turned everything over to them, and all of a sudden, the lifespan for a human being began to change. And again, this is all since the 50s, 40s, late 40s, 50s, and our lifespans begin to look like this, where the illnesses were more controllable, and we were able to go on into life and actually experience what we might call old age. And what I find fascinating, maybe even kind of a little bit funny, is when it comes to the end of our lives, even still today, officially, nobody dies of old age. I mean, it's never going to be on the death certificate that you died of old age. It's going to be respiratory failure. It's going to be cardiac arrest. Truth is, no one disease is actually going to lead to the end. The truth is, it's this accumulation of just kind of crumbling. Our bodies just kind of crumble physically, and at some point, medicine, doctors can no longer patch us up, and then we're just done. Now, I tell you all of that to tell you this. As lifespans began to change, all of a sudden, people's focus began to change. The main question people had, their main focus was this: how long can I live? What can I do to extend my life as long as possible? And so it became this passion to say, I want to live as long as I possibly can. I want to stretch this out as long as possible. And along with that then, all of a sudden, as we're striving to live longer, we fail to ask the other question, which is this: what makes life worth living when we're old and frail and we really are unable to take care of ourselves anymore? Does there reach a point where life no longer is worth living? And if I live longer, I mean, what are those last few days and months going to look like anyway? Which led Atul Gawande to conclude. He said, one of our most crucial failures in how we treat the sick and the aged is the failure to recognize that they have priorities beyond merely just being safe and living longer. It's not about stretching out just 2-3 more days, maybe a couple more weeks in my life. And the truth is, the sad truth is, living longer may not be all that it's cracked up to be. And I know we hear the occasional stories on the news where we'll hear on the news about a 94-year-old man who just finished running his 34th marathon, and we look at him and we go, that's what I'm going to be someday. But the truth is, there are very few people at his age or anywhere close to his age that are running marathons. The overwhelming majority of people are not out running marathons. They're nowhere near the ability to run marathons. And so here's what's actually happened more recently over time. We've extended life, no more abrupt endings. We've gone into old age, but all of a sudden we've stretched it out. And the part that I want to talk about today is this part right here. Not about if you're here and you have an ailment that can be taken care of, man, go for it. But it's this part right here. And how do we know when it's time to let go when we find ourselves there? Because further advances in medicine make lifespan, again, continues to increase, even though there may be little ability to actually function. And so, bottom line, when is it time to let go? Do we find ourselves at a point where we go, I think I'm done. I'm talking about the point where doctors are saying there's nothing else we can do. Everybody admits together, we're done. What do we do at that point? When is the right time to let go? So that's historically what's been happening. So let's talk about what God says about this. And does he talk specifically about that age, that period, those last few days? And so what God tells us, and he does say a number of things about you and I. First of all, he says we're incredibly important to him. So much so he actually describes us as his masterpiece. Now let me just say, if you're taking notes, and I hope you are, this is the kind of thing that, man, you're going to want to have notes and put this aside. If you don't need it now, you're going to need it someday. You're going to wish you had notes on this. I'll also say, I'm all over the outline. I know that. We've moved things around. I've moved things around. And some of you, you're going nuts. You're burning up because I've missed blanks on your outlines. Deal with it, It's just, that's just the way it is. It's so figure it out. You can move around. You can find the places. So, you and I, we are incredibly important. Oh, the other thing I'll tell you, a little secret that you may not know, out of the info desk on all of our locations, there's actually keys, answer keys there that tell you all the blanks anyway. So, incredibly important to God. God says we're his masterpieces. Genesis chapter 1 says that you and I are made in the image of God. What it actually says is, as human beings, we are the only thing in all of God's creation that are made in God's image. And so God says we're incredibly important to him. Psalm 139 tells us that we are wonderfully made. What it actually describes is when we are in our mother's womb, God takes us and he shapes us and he makes us to be exactly what he wants us to be. Ephesians 2 takes it a step further, and it says to you and me, it says we are God's masterpieces. And so you think of about a masterpiece, and that means when God looks at you, he says, oh yeah, that's it. You're beautiful. You're exactly the way I want you to be. And you may not feel like a masterpiece, but God says, oh man, I've designed you exactly the way I want you to be. Not only that, God believes in human life so much that God actually protects it. God protects human life, and He's the one that gives life and breath to all of life. One of the 10 commandments is you must not murder. God devoted one commandment to say, don't mess with human life. It's that important to me. And then when human life was lost because of sin, because of the messes that we make of our lives, then God actually stepped in and He redeemed us. And 1 John chapter 2 says this, He Himself, God Himself, Jesus, God's Son, Himself is a sacrifice that atones for our sins. Not only our sins, but the sins of all of the world. In other words, God sent Jesus, His Son, into the world that was lost. And because you and I are so valuable to Him, He was willing to send His Son to be the sacrifice so that our sins could be taken care of, so that we could live eternally with Him. God says, you are incredibly, incredibly important to Him. And I tell you all that, and you say, David, that's nice, but I mean, come on, if we're God's masterpiece, if we're all that important to God, then why is it that people still suffer? Why do people suffer around the world, specifically even today as we talk? Why do people struggle in their old age? And I've got to be honest with you, and I ask that same question. I think that's a fair question to ask. I mean, I ask, God, why? Why do you allow Ruth's mom to go on living when she doesn't have a clue what's going on around her? And God, why dementia? When is it going to end? And God, why do you allow her to stay so stiff, physically strong? I mean, she could go another 10, 15, 20 years as she is. And so I understand asking the question. I ask the same question that you do. And so do me a favor. Grab a Bible. Should be some of the seats there around you in all of our locations. And open it up to page 414. It's Job chapter 42. Job 42. Job is a man that went through more suffering, more hardship than anybody should probably have to endure, and it was incredibly difficult for him. And as he goes through these difficulties, at some point he begins to question God. He asks the questions that we ask, and God answers him. And so I want you to see God's answer. Actually, go back a couple pages to Job 38. I think it's page 411, page 38, or Job 38, page 411. Job has been asking God, come on, God, what are you doing? What are you doing? And so God answers him, and it's interesting, at some point God may answer you. Chapter 38, verse 1. Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. God said to Job, Job, who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words? Brace yourself like a man, because I have some questions for you, and you must answer them. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you know so much. Who determined its dimensions and stretched out the surveying line? What supports its foundations, and who laid its cornerstone as the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Job, who kept the sea inside its boundaries as it burst from the womb, and as I clothed it with clouds and wrapped it in thick darkness? For I locked it behind barred gates, limiting its shores. I said, this far and no further will you come, and here your proud waves must stop. Job, have you ever commanded the morning to appear and caused the dawn to rise in the east? Job, have you made daylight spread to the end of the earth to bring an end to the night's wickedness? And God goes on and on and on if you continue to read, but not right now. But if you continue to read, God continues and goes on. He says, come on, Job, you've got questions for me. I've got some for you. I want you to answer them. And so go over to chapter 42, verse 1. God has finished kind of unloading on Job, and here's Job, and Job steps back and he talks to God, and it's almost like he's this broken, humbled man. He said, then Job replied to the Lord, God, I know that you can do anything and no one can stop you. You ask, who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorance? It's I, and I was talking about things I knew nothing about, things far too wonderful for me. You said, listen, and I will speak. I have some questions for you, and you must answer. God, to that point, I'd only heard about you before, but now I have seen you with my own eyes. I take back everything I said. I sit in dust and ashes and show my repentance. And Job is just saying, oh, God, I'm so foolish. Foolish to question you. And bottom line, he's saying, God, your ways are beyond my comprehension. I can't understand everything you're doing. And I think sometimes we have to step back and say, you know what, I don't get it. I don't understand it all. And I go, okay, God, I don't know why you let people suffer through old age. I don't know why you allow Shirley to live the way she lives. I don't even like it. But God, I do trust you. And so I step back and say, okay, God, do your thing with her, whatever it is. Your ways are beyond my ways. And the good news is God isn't limited to what you and I can think. If you think you have to understand everything about God before you choose to follow him, then I'm sorry to tell you, you've got a wimpy little God. And I want a God that's a whole lot bigger than what can fit in my brain and what I can think through and I can understand. And one more thing you need to know that God says about people as we age. God says this: honor our father and our mother. God says we need to honor our father and mother. Ephesians chapter 2 actually talks about the fact that one of the first commands that ever has a promise is God's command to honor your mother and your father. And Ephesians 6:2 actually says that when we do this, the promise is that more than likely your life is going to be good if you honor your mother and your father. And so he says life will be better if you choose to do this. But he also gives a negative warning about it. Go over to 1 Timothy chapter 5, page 912. 9:12, and the Bible's there at your seats. I know I'm making you do some work and moving around here. 1 Timothy chapter 5, page 912. Paul is writing on behalf of God, and he's talking about this whole idea of honoring your mother and your father. And so he says this, 1 Timothy chapter 5, page 912. Let me begin reading verse 3. Paul says, look, take care of any widow who has no one else to care for her. But if she has children or grandchildren, their first responsibility is to show godliness at home and repay their parents by taking care of them. This is something that pleases God. So again, just note to self, whenever there's something that I can do to please God, then you go, okay, this is probably something I ought to do. And so he says, this is what pleases God. But he gives a warning, verse 8. Jump down to verse 8. He says, but those who don't care for their relatives, especially those in their own household, they have denied the faith. Such people are worse than unbelievers. And bottom line, he's saying it's almost like they've rejected God completely, and you don't want to be there. You don't want to do that. And so he says, honor your mother, your father. Bottom line, what God says about human life, he says it's a big deal to him. It's really important to him. I think he says don't mess with human life. Now, all that's nice, but it still doesn't really spell out what to do in those final days. How does that help me know when it's time to let go? And it's not spelled out, which means God is giving us a choice. He's giving us some leeway here as to how we're going to spend our final days of our lives. And because it's our choice, here's what I want to challenge you on. I think this is a discussion that's worth having with your family. And it doesn't matter how old you are. You can have it now. Maybe it's better when you're younger. At some point, you need to have the discussion. It's definitely time to have with your aging parents, family members, whomever it may be. And really the question that you're asking, and you want to do this before somebody's laying in a hospital bed. You want to have it when everybody's thinking rationally. And the conversation you're really asking, and the question you're asking is this: do I want to stay alive as long as possible at any cost? Do I want to stretch my life out if there's just a couple more days I can squeeze out of it? Do I want to live as long as possible at any cost, or am I more concerned about having a good life to the very end? Is the quality of life that I have important to me? And can I just tell you my observation? As I watch what happens as it comes down to those final few days, end of life, too often what I see happen, we're making choices of sacrificing the quality of life just to gain a little bit more time. And we're kind of saying, oh, I know it's over, but man, if I could just squeeze a couple more days out of this, that would be great. And in medical treatment, they're always going to push and say, what can we do to extend, give you as much time as possible? That's why Atul Gawande, who's a doctor, a medical clinician himself, he actually says this. He says, the only thing that clinicians seem to fear is doing too little. They're worried about, oh, what if we don't do enough to extend a person's life? When, he says, the real issue, most have no appreciation that equally terrible mistakes are possible in either direction, that doing too much could be no less devastating to a person's life. It's not just a matter of what if we don't do enough, but what if we do too much in this process as well, is what he's saying. Which, as I look at that bottom line, I say, really the question then for us that we've got to figure out in our lives is, how far do we go? When do I know if I've got to keep trying to fix things, patch somebody up to be able to keep going? When do we say, okay, I think we're done here. I think it's the end of life. And Came across the story of a man named Joseph Larazov. Joseph Larazov was a city administrator. He lost his wife years before to cancer. He was diagnosed in his 60s with cancer as well. They called it incurable cancer, and he'd lost 50 pounds, woke up one morning, didn't have use of his legs anymore, couldn't control his bowels. He was admitted to the hospital. They found the cancer had spread throughout his entire body. They said, there's no way we can cure this. There's nothing we can do for you. But they said, we might be able to do some things to just extend a little bit longer. So Joseph was given two choices. He could allow the doctors to administer what they called comfort care, to say, we want to do what we can to make you as comfortable as you can be for the remaining days of your life, or we can do surgery to try to remove a tumor that might give you a little bit more time. But they said, understand, the surgery's not going to cure you. It's not going to give you the life that you'd had before. It's not going to reverse your paralysis. No matter what they did, they said, at best, we're just giving you a few weeks, maybe a couple of months more to live. They said the surgery's going to be dangerous. We're going to have to go in, open up your chest, remove a rib, collapse a lung to get to that tumor. You may not even make it out of surgery. And so he faced a decision. Comfort care, do I want a good life to the very end, or do I want to extend as long as I possibly can? And came with immeasurable risk. Hearing his options, he said to the doctor, don't you give up on me. He said, you give me every chance that I've got, and he chose to move ahead with the surgery. But the surgery didn't give him what he was looking for. It didn't take him back to where he had been, what he'd hoped, what he'd dreamed about. Instead, it was an 8.5-hour surgery. The tumor pressing against his spine was removed, so technically it was a success, but he never recovered from the procedure. In intensive care, he experienced respiratory failure, an infection, blood clots, bleeding because of blood thinners that were treating him. 14 days after his surgery, he dies in intensive care when he's taken off the ventilator, and that's it, and it's over with. And everyone involved knew that he faced a problem that could not be cured. It was just old age. He'd just come to the end of his life, but no one could bring themselves to admit the fact that it was done. Nobody came to the point of being able to say, hey, what questions can we talk and answer about to kind of help us figure out what we should do and make the right decision. See, one of the things that you begin to realize, there's a lot of things that we can do, but it's not always what we should do. And yes, at that final moment, we make decisions to say, oh, just give me a couple more days. That's all I'm looking for, the hope of that. When more often than not, it ends up where somebody's just dying alone in the hospital, ventilator down their throat. And there are some things that we can do. It's not always the best things. And here's the conclusion. What I'm coming to as I look at all this is, you know what? I don't think extraordinary measures are required. It's not required that we take them to keep a dying person alive at all costs for just a little bit longer. I don't think God requires us to say you've got to do everything you can to keep this person alive as long as you possibly can. I think it's okay to say, I think it's time to let go. So again, you have to decide, and it requires conversations to have. So let me give you some questions to kind of start a conversation, and as you have these conversations, as you ask the questions, the way you answer the questions, maybe helps determine what direction you want to go as you move on in your life. And so the first question that you'd want to ask is this: what's your understanding of your current health condition? Do you understand the situation you're really in? Joseph Lazaroff, he didn't understand. He thought, if I have this surgery, I can get back to my old life. Everything will be like it was. There was no hope of that. Do you understand your current condition? What you're choosing is incredibly risky. It's not going to take you back to where you think. And so is your choice, do you want to do everything possible to keep you alive? Do you understand your situation? Second question to ask is, if your current condition worsens, what are your goals? What do you hope out of this? What do you think is going to happen? What do you want to do with the time that you have left on this earth? Do you want to pursue all possible treatments to the point where you don't know what's going to happen, or do you want to forgo some treatments and say, you know what, I'm not sure I want the impact that it's going to have on the quality of my life. I think I will forgo that. And so what are your goals? How do you want to spend your last few days? Third question to ask is, what are your fears? What is it you're afraid of? Is it you're afraid of leaving your family behind? Is it you're afraid of being lonely? Is it afraid of you're just not sure about what comes next? What are your fears in all this? And fourth question to ask, are there any trade-offs that you'd be willing to make or not make? Are you willing to say, you know what, there's some treatments that I could have, but if I do that, I may spend the rest of my days in intensive care, unconscious, unaware of anything that's going on in my life. Or I could say, you know what, let's go for comfort care, and then I can choose how I spend my last few days, and I could be surrounded by family. And last question to ask, if you get to your final days, and again, this is where we're talking about the final days, what would a good day be like for you? What would it actually look like for you? One woman, Roz Chast, actually said this about the end of life. As she thought about it, she said, I wish at the end of life, when things were truly done, when it's really over with, there was something to look forward to. Something like pleasure-oriented things, and she gives a list of what kind of pleasure-oriented things. Like all-you-can-eat ice cream parlors for the extremely aged. That's just all who it's for. Or big art picture books and music. She said that would be kind of a wonderful thing. Or extreme palliative care for when you've had it with everything else, the x-rays, the MRIs, the boring food, the pills that don't do anything at all anyway. Would that be so bad? And she's just saying, it's kind of coming to the point of saying, okay, I think we're done. And so why not make it as pleasurable as possible, which Atul Gawande says, bottom line, he said our ultimate goal, after all, it's not a good death, but as good of life to the very end. And how do we experience that? And so my challenge to you is have the discussion. Bring it up with your family at the appropriate time and talk about how you want to spend your final days. And for those that are in their final days around you, if you're in the middle of this right now, my challenge for you as you talk about this with them is that you would also do everything you can to give people the very best possible day. It's down to just the last few days. So what decisions can you help them make to give them the very best possible day? And I understand there's a lot of fear wrapped up in our final days. Maybe it's a fear of leaving family behind. Maybe it's a fear of loneliness. I do think one of our greatest fears, even for those of us that are followers of Jesus, sometimes our greatest fear is I just don't know exactly what it's going to be like on the other side, and what is it really like? And John Ortberg is a writer. He tells a story about his fascination with trapeze artists. And so much so that he actually signed up for a session at the Circus Center in San Francisco where they taught classes on trapeze flying. And he'd been told that he was on a waiting list. The class was full, so he went anyway, just intending to watch what was going on. But when it came time for the class, one of the other students saw how high the trapeze was off the ground. Suddenly she remembered she had a previous engagement, and so he got into the class. And so he was introduced to Alan, and Alan was going to be his catcher, the person that was going to catch John. And so John immediately began to size him up to figure out how strong is he and how long are his arms. You need long arms to catch. And then does he have sweaty hands? You don't want a catcher that has sweaty hands. And so he's sizing him up. And the instructor, as he's talking, he began to explain. He said there are two types of trapeze artists. He said two types of trapeze artists. One is the flyer. The flyer's the one that everybody notices. They're the one doing the somersaults. They're the one that get all the attention. They're the flyers. And he said, then you've got the catchers. Nobody really notices the catchers. They're just there swinging back and forth while we're all watching the flyer as they go. And he went on to explain, he said, you know who the real heroes are when it comes to trapeze? He said, it's the catcher. The catcher is the one that's really the hero. He said the secret is that the flyer does nothing and the catcher does everything. And when you fly to Alan, John, he said, simply all you have to do is stretch out your arms and your hands and you wait for him to catch you and pull you safely to the apron on the other side of the catch bar. And John is listening. He goes, you're kidding me. I do nothing? And the instructor said, you do nothing at all. A flyer must fly, a catcher must catch. The flyer must trust with outstretched arms that his catcher is going to be there for him. And so John started climbing the ladder to the platform in the Circus Center. He said, I kind of decided I really didn't want to fly at all. And he said, I didn't really want to obey their instructions. I didn't want to lean out over the platform. I didn't want to jump. I didn't want to stretch out my arms. I didn't want to let go of the bar. And he said, and yet there was just enough trust, barely enough trust to go ahead and do it anyway. So he did it, and he said, and then those strong arms and hands appeared out of nowhere, and they grasped onto my outstretched arms. He caught me, he said, and the two of us became one, and he makes it through. And can I suggest to you that dying is a whole lot like trapeze artist, and you and I, we're the flyers. You and I are the flyers, and God is the catcher. And when we're talking to somebody about to die, or as you face death in the future, that as one who is a flyer, about one who is the catcher, you say to the flyer, don't be afraid. Remember, you're a beloved child of God, and He's going to be there when you make your long jump. And don't try to grab Him. You don't need to try to grab after Him. He's going to grab you. You just stretch your arms out, and you wait for Him to grab yours, and you just trust. You just trust Him. And God is the ultimate catcher. And see, bottom line, God's in control. God knows your days. You don't need to try to stretch them out as long as you possibly can. God is in control, and you're not alone in this situation. God says, I will be with you every step of the way. And then a better place awaits. And so often I think we forget this. Maybe we just doubt that it's there. And so we're praying for our loved ones and we say, oh God, do a miracle, do something so they can just live a little bit longer. When God is saying, oh, if you only knew what's on the other side, it is so much better than you could possibly dream or think or imagine. Why would you want them to stay in that condition just another day? God is in control. You are not alone. Something better awaits. And have the conversation. You and I are on this journey, and have the conversation. Figure out what it is that you want for your final days. And if this is something we could pray with you about, up on the left front corner, all of our auditoriums, after every gathering, there are people there that would love to pray with you about this or really anything that you're going through. But I step back and go, okay, God, you're the catcher. I'm the flyer. Now I just need to trust you. Heavenly Father, it's hard to let go of that bar. It's hard to want to hang on. It's hard to want to can we just stay a little bit longer, God? And yet you tell us, you know what, at some point it's time to let go of the bar and trust you. Heavenly Father, I pray that you would give us the opportunity over the next days and weeks to actually have conversations that maybe we've never had before. To talk about what do we want the end of our lives to look like. And Father, as we have those conversations, I ask that you'd give us wisdom. I ask that you'd give us courage to have them. Wisdom as we have them. Give us dialogue, Father, where we talk to our parents, our loved ones. We think it through for ourselves. What is it we want for the end of our days? Father, I thank you that you love us so much, that you tell us we are your masterpiece. And Father, you sent Jesus into the world to make sure that your masterpieces could spend eternity with you. Thank you, Father, for Jesus. Thank you for loving us. Thank you that in the midst of these discussions and when we find ourselves in those final days at the end of our life, you don't leave us alone. You're there with us every step of the way. And God, I just say thank you. Thank you that you're the catcher. Give us the courage to stretch our arms out to you and to trust you. And I pray in Jesus' name, amen.